We are letting people in and playing the music. Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this special edition. I guess you would call it a special edition of Veterans Breakfast Club. Hey, you know what? I'm gonna have to mute everybody. I forgot to set that part of it up. I'm flying solo here without my usual wingman, John Hall, which means that there we go, except me. So people can unmute themselves. They could ask to unmute. Here, let's see. I will not allow participants to unmute themselves. But if you would like to be unmuted, just raise your hand or put your hand up here if you have something to say. I notice we have a lot of people who have joined us before. We have people who have actually been on our trip to Vietnam, and Chad Riddle and Ben Wright. Colonel Washabaugh is in with us as per usual. Good to see you, Brad. Ron Stakovich, Jim Roberts, who I will see tomorrow, Don Nemchek. I'll see you, Jim. I'm going to have you talk tomorrow if you don't mind. But I also see some newcomers. So I just want to introduce myself. I'm Todd DePastino. I am the director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we're a nonprofit that has been around since 2008, holding events where veterans can share their stories. And we do it in person at events like the one that we're going to be having tomorrow in Penn. And we also do it online. We do it on our program that we call VBC Happy Hour every Monday night at 7 p.m. Let's see here. Got it. Okay. So this is a little different, though, that we're doing this evening. This is a special event, and it's really one that's geared around our trip to Vietnam. This is our third trip that the Veterans Breakfast Club has done to Vietnam. We began doing the trip. The first trip was in 2018, and it coincided with the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive. And you should know that I'm not a veteran, even though I direct a veterans organization. I'm a historian, and that's how I got so interested in veteran stories. And I noticed that in 2018 that it was going to be the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive. And I had taught courses on the Vietnam War and the history of Vietnam for years at Penn State Beaver and at Waynesburg University. And I had known enough to know that the Tet Offensive is one of the most important events, not only of the Vietnam War, but in American history, certainly one of the seminal events of the 20th century. And I was determined that it should be commemorated, that 50th anniversary should be commemorated. Certainly it's an event with a complex history, but it should be commemorated on par with, say, the events of 9/11 or the attacks of Pearl Harbor. And then in talking with veterans, began to understand that there was some interest among some veterans in returning to Vietnam, and that those who had returned to Vietnam and reported back on the experience were extremely pleased with the going back, and actually going back was a kind of a healing experience. So we decided to do a trip. We ended up taking 17 of us, I think, ended up traveling together, including 6 Vietnam veterans, those who served in country in Vietnam. And it was a transformative experience, I think, for everybody on the trip. I think that's fair to say. Certainly it was for me. I included a kind of a story of what I learned in one of our recent VBC magazines that came out earlier this year. And I thought what I would do, as we are looking to do our third trip to Vietnam, we're going to be traveling November 27th through December 11th. I thought I would kind of, talk just generally about, and impressionistically, about some of the things that I was not aware of when I spent years teaching Vietnam, and some of the things that I learned upon, or going to Vietnam, touring the country. I thought this would be the first of 5 talks that I'll do. The next one will be next Wednesday at 7 p.m. I'll be sending out an email about that. Again, it'll focus on really the history and culture of Vietnam. It will not be a chronological march through history. It'll not be a play-by-play kind of rehearsal of the war. It will be rather scattered. I'm usually, being a historian, I'm a chronology guy, but this one's a little different. I'm going to be moving around, going to ancient history, back up to contemporary Vietnam, in order to try and get a sampling. It's kind of a sampler's platter of Vietnam culture, country, history, including the current day. The timing for this series of lectures is a good one, because the documentary that was made of our first trip in 2018 is just now out on Blu-ray, and it's also available on streaming. You could order the Blu-ray edition of We Left as Brothers, returning to Vietnam 50 years after the war. You could order it from Amazon or eBay or Best Buy or Walmart. But it's streaming. You could also purchase it streaming and watch it streaming on Amazon. And that's probably the simplest way for most people to watch it. I do recommend watching it. It's a very powerful film, I think. We did bring along a young filmmaker, Evan Mulgrave, on the trip in 2018. He spent a lot of time taking footage. He interviewed each and every veteran all the way through the trip, and then did a wonderful job editing it all down and bringing it all together in a very powerful 1-hour documentary. You could see our own Andy Niggett, who is here with us on the call tonight. He's our cover boy on the Blu-ray edition here, him encountering a former NVA soldier in their kind of emotional encounter there on the DMZ. It's quite a wonderful story. I do encourage you to watch it. Very, very well done. And I'm so grateful to Evan, who I do see every once in a while, for being able to work so hard and put that film together. These thoughts are going to be rather disparate. I'll be talking about the culture and the people of Vietnam. It is, I think it's fair to say that Vietnam is by definition exotic to the United States. In other words, it's a culture that I think that's unfamiliar to a lot of Americans, and it takes some translation and interpretation. As you know, that's what travel is for. There's a lot of thinking and interpretation, seeing the world differently, seeing the world through the eyes of the people that you're, in amongst when you travel. That will be something that you do as a traveler in Vietnam. And I should, by the way, say that there are several people who are going on the trip. We have 20 of us going on the trip, the Veterans Breakfast Club trip, leaving November 27. 20 of us will be traveling together. Several of them are here in the Zoom room with us tonight. Hopefully after this very brief talk, we'll have some conversation about the trip. I know people who have gone on the trip with us before are also on. And I should let people know that there is still room on the trip. I checked with Gate 1. We had a Marine who served in I Corps who came very close. He just asked me very recently, hey, I'd like to go. Is there space? And I checked with our Gate 1 travel, who's arranging our nuts and bolts of the travel. And they said, yeah, they could probably squeeze them in. So if you are still looking to travel, if you'd like to go to Vietnam, we still could add another person if you'd like. Then I'm going to talk about the culture and the people a bit tonight. Next week, I'm going to really focus on the history of the war, especially the politics of the war. The U.S. got involved and how the war was fought. That will be the focus next week. And then toward the end, I'm going to talk a bit about Vietnam now, what it is, what it's like now. Vietnam is one of the most dynamic countries in the world, something that nobody, I think, who knew Vietnam 35 or 40 years ago could ever have imagined that Vietnam, a staid one-party communist state, one of the poorest in the nation, if in the world, if not the poorest in the Eastern Hemisphere, would suddenly become a dynamic economic powerhouse and have more economic growth than any country in the world, I think is something that nobody could have imagined, 40 years ago. So it's a remarkable country to visit. to know the history, to know the culture, to know the natural beauty, and also to see the dynamism of it today is quite something. The trip that we're taking takes us really down the length of Vietnam, because Vietnam is a country without much breadth. It's all length. It's 1,000 miles long and 30 miles wide at its narrowest. It kind of hugs the Annam mountain range to the west and is hemmed in by what they call the East Sea or the South China Sea to the east. And so it has a distinctive history and great variability as you move north and south in the terrain, in the weather, in the geography, and in the people. It changes dramatically as you move down. We'll be arriving in Hanoi, going to Haiphong Harbor, which is has an important place in Vietnamese history. And then we'll make our way down finally to Ho Chi Minh City in the south, and even spend a day in the Mekong Delta. And so we're getting kind of a sense of the entire country. And I think that's so important, because each region is almost a country in itself. And when you go to Vietnam, you awaken to the unbelievable diversity of the country and the people. And if you want to speak roughly about Vietnam and about the divisions within Vietnam, I think that 17th parallel, that was that division, that DMZ, that was created in Geneva at a negotiating table in 1954 for the first time, dividing the country into two regroupment zones that were meant to be temporary and meant to be reunified eventually. You understand when you travel to Vietnam why that 17th parallel seemed a good place to divide the country. It was it's a narrow border, but also there's a real disconnect, a real difference between the people and the culture of the North and the people and the culture of the South. Difference in language, difference in customs, traditions, outlook, politics, you name it. And you see it and you feel it everywhere. So we arrive on our trip. We arrive in Hanoi, and we've taken this trip again. This will be our third one that we're taking in November. We went in 2018 and went also in 2020. Both times arrive in Hanoi. And we do this deliberately. We had discussed maybe doing the river, starting in a place that's more familiar, like Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. But we decided, let's start in Hanoi. Let's start in the least familiar, in the most exotic, in the most Vietnamese of Vietnam. Hanoi is the ancient cradle of Vietnamese culture and civilization. This is where it all began, right here in the Red River Delta around Hanoi. This is the Red River that flows out to Haiphong Harbor, to the Gulf of Tonkin. Hanoi is the birthplace of civilization. Everything else was added on later. But so the Vietnamese view, especially those in the North, view Hanoi and view the North and the people who live here as the real Vietnamese. These are, I don't know, maybe it's how Texans view, themselves as the real Americans or something like that. Maybe it's like the Alamo, or I don't think that we have an equivalent in this country of that sense of like the ancient cradle of our civilization, because all of us came from somewhere else, United States. But in Vietnam, absolutely, this is the ancient cradle of civilization. You arrive, you get an immediate sense of its differentness, of its exoticness, that it is a very different land with a very different culture. You also get a sense immediately of the antiquity of the culture. I think that's the first thing you feel as an American, that in Vietnam, they don't measure their history in centuries, they measure it in millennia. 1776. I mean, when did the United States begin? Some people say, 1776. Maybe you could think about, the Americas being discovered in 1492. By 1492, Vietnam had already existed for thousands of years. I mean, there was people, the Van Lang people who had been called Viet, lived in the Hanoi Red River Delta area 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, the Van Lang civilization was noted by travelers from the north. So this is a culture that is truly ancient and existed independent of China or any other colonial power until the year 111 BCE, before the Common Era. That's when the Chinese Han Dynasty invaded the Van Lang civilization, invaded that southern territory, and took it over and ruled over Vietnam for 1,000 years. 1,000 years of Chinese rule. You immediately then, after talking to Vietnamese people, you do immediately sense this powerful suspicion of China. The American War, fought with intensity over 8 years, lower intensity over longer. The American War is a blip, not even a blip, on the radar screen in the Vietnam timeline. China occupied Vietnam for 1,000 years. Nobody's ever going to top that. China will always be the very threatening big brother that looms to the north. In fact, China, it's like the Vietnamese owe so much to China. They owe everything. They owe their name to China. Vietnam, what it means is Viet, the people who live to the south, the land to the south, the people beyond the south. The Chinese named them Viet, Nam, south. It's almost as if China considers Vietnam its southernmost colony. It's not too much of an exaggeration to say that. And that awareness of the Chinese consciousness is very, that has shaped Vietnamese identity. They struggle to maintain an independence from China. So this is the Han Dynasty, about the time in red here, about the time that it invaded Vietnam. And when I say it invaded Vietnam, I say it invaded that part right there, that part circled in red, not the Vietnam we know, but the Red River Delta, that area around, stretching from just west of Hanoi, east to Haiphong Harbor. That is the area, that was the cradle of Vietnamese civilization that China named Vietnam and took over and ruled for 1,000 years, 1,000 years. And then, and you could say that the Chinese gave Vietnam everything, and that's not too much of an exaggeration. The Chinese gave the Vietnamese people a written language, gave them rice cultivation, gave them engineering, to how to engineer irrigation for the rice cultivation, gave them a Mandarin system of, bureaucratic administration, you name it, ways of warfare, methods of warfare. China kind of schooled the Vietnamese people in all sorts of things, modernized Vietnam. And a remarkable thing that the Vietnamese did over these 900 years as they absorbed, it took a couple hundred years, I should say, from 111 BCE to maybe 100 AD, or the Common Era. It took a couple hundred years for the Vietnamese to absorb these lessons and then turn them against their occupier. So the resistance, 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 the resist to Chinese imperialism, Chinese colonialism, began about 100 BC, BE, the common CE, the common era. AD, I keep on thinking AD. About 100 AD is when the resistance to Chinese colonialization really took off, and the Vietnamese struggled for hundreds of years against their Chinese occupier, finally winning independence from China in the year 938 AD. This is when Vietnam wins its independence. So long before Columbus discovers America, Vietnam wins a 1,000-year armed struggle against their colonial occupiers of China. And they did it, as you can imagine, through trickery, what we might call guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and they did it here in this Bac Dong, the Bac Dong River, which feeds out to the Haiphong harbor area. So we'll be at Haiphong. This is a historic area because this is the area, this is how China invaded in the first place, up the river, up the Red River to Hanoi. And it's here that China met its defeat in 938. China would attempt to retake Vietnam several times, and each time they would be repulsed. So there would be the second battle of the Bac Dong River occurred in the year 1288. Again, long before Columbus discovers America, Vietnam is defending its independence in a spectacular way in these battles that loom so large in the Vietnamese consciousness. As you go through towns and cities in Vietnam, you see these statues of these great Vietnamese, fierce Vietnamese warriors that have nothing to do with the American war or with the war against the French or anything like that. Vietnamese really do spend a lot of time in their historical imaginations 1,000 years ago. They really do understand that their most developmental period was the struggle against China. Here's how they did it. There was a lot of turmoil, a lot of uprising, insurgency in Vietnam against the Chinese administrators. And so China decided to bring in 938 a very large army and navy on thousands of ships. The estimates are 200,000 maybe warriors floating in, sailing in up the Red River. And the Vietnamese had their own fairly large, for the Vietnamese, navy there at the mouth of the river. And the Vietnamese sacrificed a few of their ships and then escaped up the river at high tide. The Chinese army and navy followed them well up the river. And then just as they reached the critical point up the river toward Hanoi, the tides lowered in precise timing, only to reveal these pikes made of, I don't know, teak or some kind of hardwood that caught the Chinese ships in a trap, literally in a trap. The ships couldn't move, they couldn't sail, and the soldiers on them were sitting ducks. Thousands upon thousands of guerrilla fighters then emerged from the banks of the river and flew flaming arrows at the ships, killing, the estimates are, maybe as many as 100,000 Chinese warriors over the span of the next several days. So this was a major battle that would be repeated, and the victory would be repeated. It's something that's very much remembered. These pikes are still in existence. They've been discovered. They're being preserved. They're being studied. And this is very much a part of the Vietnamese identity, how they won and then kept their independence from China. And again, this is the Vietnam. This is where it began. This is where this began it all. And then once that independence was achieved up here in the Red River area, there began an immediate kind of march to the south. After all, the Vietnamese had achieved their independence via warfare. And so it gave rise to a martial culture, a culture that celebrated, martial warriors or martial victors, heroes, military heroes. And they began to mobilize. And kind of do what the Chinese did to them, march down south and take over other peoples. Because all along the coastline here, along the East Sea and South China Sea, were other peoples, other civilizations that lived and thrived in the years before the what the Vietnamese called the March to the South. And that's what they did rather quickly in the next couple of centuries. By the time you can see this is the progress that was made, the Shampa people or ancient Muslim people kind of taken over, conquered on the way down. By the time of the U.S. Revolutionary War, what we know of as Vietnam is unified. It's together. The modern map of Vietnam has kind of been created through this march to the south. And the Vietnamese called themselves then their own empire, the Dai Viet or Great Viet. It was the Great Viet. This is the ancient Vietnam, and this is the Great Viet. This is the Vietnam beyond Vietnam, what they had conquered. And so again, the Vietnamese in the north see themselves as, I think, the real Vietnamese, and everybody to the south is kind of like you're kind of suspicious of. The south, much more cosmopolitan, much more international, much more multinational, much more progressive, much more individualistic, much more of exposure to the rest of the world. It's in the north where the Vietnamese are kind of conservative and patriarchal and patriotic and communist. We arrive at Noi Bai Airport, and I'll always remember, again, Andy Niggett being on that trip and him saying, as we kind of walked up to get our papers checked to enter the country, the people behind the desk looked remarkably like the NVA soldiers that Andy had fought in the Marine Corps with in I Corps in 1968. And he leaned over and said, I don't like the look of these guys. And I did not blame him. I mean, come on, could you update these uniforms? I mean, these uniforms look exactly like they did in 1968. And you see people wearing these pith helmets in the north and uniforms like this, just like they did in the 1960s during the Vietnam War. And that's kind of shocking. And then we, met our bus, and we'll meet in Khan, who is our guide. And Khan will be our guide again. He was our guide in 2020. He will be our guide again in November and December this year. He is phenomenal. He's in his late 30s. His father served in the NVA, was an NVA soldier who toted equipment and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. His English is good. His love of Americans is strong. And what makes him especially great, I think, as a tour guide is his curiosity. He's like some of the best students I've ever had and some of the best teachers I've ever known. Insatiably curious, just always wanting to learn more, always wanting to hear, always interested in other perspectives. Very thoughtful, reserved, quiet, thoughtful person. And when he shares a story, it's meaningful. He's with us the whole time, from really the time we arrive in Hanoi to the time we leave 13 days later. And the whole time he's with us, it's kind of this ongoing conversation where he's learning about the American perspective. He's asking our Vietnam veterans about their experiences, and he's sharing what he knows and what he thinks we might be interested in and might be curious about. He's pointing things out that we'd not seen before. And very early on in the tour, Khan said something that I think really had a deep impact on me. He said, to understand Vietnam, you have to understand Confucianism. Confucius, ancient Chinese philosopher who was hired by an emperor to do one thing, and that was to develop a social theory, a philosophy of government and of society that would ensure the endurance of the empire. It's one thing to build a great civilization, an empire. It's another thing to keep it. Empires inevitably, it seems, rise and then fall. And the ancient emperor wanted to know, what kind of values do we have to have a civilization that will endure, that won't rise and fall, but will be steady and enduring over time. And that was the root of Confucianism. Confucianism, a political philosophy, a philosophy of life that emphasizes more than anything else stability, unity, social cohesion, social order, the collective survival. That's all the stability of the community. That's all emphasized. You cannot imagine a less American philosophy. I mean, our country, the United States, is built on just the opposite: mobility, individuality, individualism, progress, change, disorder, creative destruction, disruption, all those kind of things. Those are the kinds of things that we have tended to celebrate in the United States, over the centuries, and very much the mirror opposite of Vietnam. And I think that really does played into the war. And I think it plays into a lot of the social differences we even see today. One place you see, once you understand the depth of Confucian thought and feeling in Vietnam, you begin to see it playing everywhere. You see it in the schools, you see it in how families function, how men and women interact, how people interact with the government. You see it also in the traffic. The traffic in Vietnam is a wonder to behold. There's a lot of it. As a fast-growing economy with 100 million people, people are moving around all over the place, buying and selling things. And there are cars, there are a growing number of cars in Vietnam, but still most people get around on motorbikes. And there's this whole hierarchy of motorbikes. You could tell how wealthy somebody is by what kind of motorbike they have, what kind of helmet they have. But because they rely on these motorbikes, they transport all kinds of stuff. You see whole families on motorbikes. You see chickens. Farmers are bringing their wares to market on motorbikes. Deliveries are being made on motorbikes. You can't believe. Here's a guy with eggs, in front of him and back of him. Great big, huge vases here, and chickens here, and produce here, goldfish there. Whole families, appear on motorbikes. I mean, it's not uncommon to see 4 people on one bike. Just absolutely stunning. And it seems that the traffic is busy. It doesn't seem like there's really a rush hour. Every hour is rush hour. I mean, it just seems like the streets are packed, 24 hours a day, and mostly with motorbikes. They're just everywhere. And what's stunning to me, and what we see when we traveled to Vietnam for the first time, is how these motorbikes, this traffic, it just seems so chaotic. Everybody gets around without any traffic laws, speed limits, stop signs, red lights. There are crosswalks, but nobody seems to really pay them much attention. I mean, here's it reminds me of like a murmuration of starlings, or a school of sardines, or something like that, where kind of everybody knows how the people around them are moving, and they're moving in conjunction with the movements of other people, that there's a great awareness of where everybody else is and where everybody else needs to be going, and how you have to accommodate other people just as other people accommodate you. And it's all done without any traffic laws. It's just stunning, which means, and nobody stops, which means that crossing the street is kind of an adventure. And in fact, I was warned that. You could consult YouTube, how to cross the road in Vietnam. There are lots of YouTube videos. how to do it. And it's really quite simple. I traveled when we went in 2018. I went with my younger daughter. My younger daughter came along. She was a high school kid. And in 2020, my older daughter came along. She had just graduated college. And, she and I would, when I first arrived and saw the traffic, I thought, you know what, I'll just stay on my side of the street the whole trip. I mean, why do I really need to cross the road? But eventually, I kind of screwed up the courage. My daughter, Libby, said, don't worry, Dad, I'll hold your hand. And, and the way you do it is you kind of have to enter the stream. You have to become a sardine. You have to become one of those starlings. You have to enter the stream and flow in the stream at a steady pace. So you step off the curb and then you start walking across the other side. You don't zigzag. You don't worry about who's coming at you. You just keep up your speed and your pace. Don't change your pace. Don't speed up. Don't slow down, because that screws everybody else up. And as you walk across the street, a motorbike will zip behind you and zip in front of you the whole time that you're going across the street, and you're not hit. You feel the wind, and it works. It's stunning how it works, and it works because of Confucianism. What's stunning is there's so much traffic, there's so much movement, there's very little horns honking at all. Usually the horn honks are indicating something, just like, hey, I'm here, hey, I'm coming behind. There's absolutely zero road rage. You will not hear swear words. You will not see anybody, shake their fist or anything like that, because Confucianism so emphasizes courtesy and harmony and unity. And hey, Annette, how are you?
I'm great. My husband, John, has a question.
No, it's
Hey,
not a question.
for you?
A statement. I lived in Saigon from 69 to 70, right on Tran Hung Dao, which is one of the major thoroughfares. And I lived in a hotel, and it was a Y intersection. And you're absolutely right about the traffic flow. And somebody had on the US side had this great idea to put some order to the process of traffic. So these big concrete abutments that you see down interstate highways when there's construction, they put those about 300 yards in from intersections, and hoping to create some semblance of traffic flow. Well, when we were done, I taught English as a second language to Vietnamese officers in the Air Force. And at night, we had nothing to do, so we sat on the balcony and we would watch the traffic. And if anybody was ever in Saigon, the taxis were these little Renault Dauphines. They were kind of a cream colored and blue. And these things they didn't have any lights on. They'd go around the corners at night, and they would hit these embankments, flip over, and everybody would stop, get out, push the car back up, everybody would take off again. So you're right about how everybody kind of had their place and what they did. And as far as crossing the street, you're absolutely right. You start, you don't stop.
You start and you don't stop. And it's all possible because of this Confucius social ethic that does emphasize courtesy, harmony, consider the other people. Anger, there's a real prohibition of showing anger, real prohibition in Northern Vietnamese culture. So you don't see it. It's not something that's permitted. Controlling your own personal desires, hugely important. And you can begin, put the pieces to this all together. You begin to understand, oh, okay, that's why a portion of the population was attracted to communism, because it was just a natural kind of extension of the social ethic that had been ingrained for hundreds of years. And you do see it everywhere, including the traffic. Now, as you move south, the traffic patterns they're still crazy, but because in the South they're much more American, They're much more cosmopolitan. They're much less Confucius oriented. Because of that, there are traffic signs in Saigon. I mean, if you couldn't cross the street in Saigon the way you do in Hanoi because you'd get killed. So there are stoplights, there are walk signals, just like there are in the United States. People in the North don't need them. They police themselves. Saigon people need to be policed. You also see it. Another significant difference, I think we all noticed this, was in the gender roles and in the clothing that people wore, North and South. Again, in the North, much more traditional, much more conservative, much more communist, you could say, much more patriarchal also. So there's a real gender divide, and Confucianism absolutely emphasized this, that, there was a gender hierarchy. It was a patriarchal, male-dominated culture. You see it there in the North. Men and women are very much separate. Women tend to be demure, and they tend to be they're either working in the fields, or they are dressed up to look good. You don't see the kind of professional women that you do in the South, and you also don't see in the North the kind of hairstyles you see in the South. The kind, you walk out the streets today, and you see people with dyed hair and earrings and crazy tattoos and stuff like that. We're very used to that here. You see women wearing, bearing their shoulders here. You also see that in Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, Da Nang in the South, but you don't see it very much in the North. In the North, very conservative dress, traditional dress, and that stands out. One thing I learned that I didn't know was that Vietnam is very much a drinking culture. I'd assumed for some reason that the national drink would probably be some kind of rice wine, and it's not really. It's beer. Beer is what they drink. And I would love to say that it's all good. I like a good craft beer, but this ain't craft beer, especially the 333. Many of you will remember that or the 3-3 it was called, back in the Vietnam War. But every town has its own beer. There's Huda, Hue beer. There's beer Saigon, beer Hanoi, and they drink it a lot, all the time. I mean, they will drink it with breakfast. They drink it at lunch. They drink it at dinner. And on the tour, almost all of our meals are provided by the tour. And at every meal, we're served beer. And early on, as we would, I'd have a beer with dinner or lunch. Con kind of looked at us and said, "I think it's funny how you Americans drink beer." And I said, "What's so funny about it?" And he said, "Well, you only have one or two." And I said, "Is that unusual?" And he said, "Yeah, like when you drink beer, you are dedicated to it. I mean, you just drink and drink and drink until you become," and he said some word in Vietnamese. And I said, "What does the word," I figured the word in Vietnamese meant drunk. "What does the word in Vietnamese mean?" And he said, "It means Spider-Man." That's the word, that's the slang in Vietnam when you become so drunk that you have to feel your way along walls to get back home. And that's a common thing. Men in the North, especially, you'll see men sitting out on the sidewalk drinking beer, not with women, but with each other, like these guys here in this picture. And they'll stay for a long time, and they'll drink a lot of beer. I think that alcoholism must be a real problem in Vietnam. Officially, there's very little on that I could find on alcoholism as a problem in Vietnam. And I asked Con about that. I said, is alcoholism a problem? And he didn't really know what I was asking. I said, like, is there anything like AA, Alcoholics Anonymous? And he had not heard of what that was. He didn't know what that was. And I said, Con, well, what do people do when men or anybody drinks too much? And he said, "Oh, yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Oh, yeah, we have a solution for that. The wife just takes away the man's money." And I thought, oh, man, Okay. So this is, and that's a northerner's perspective. Con is from Hanoi, and that's a very kind of patriarchal, traditional, you might say, gender divide there. One thing that I did know going to Vietnam, and I my radar was up for this, was that the Vietnamese people need to know, and they're very curious about your age when you meet them. They want to know your age. But they also know that it's not considered very polite to ask somebody's age upon first meeting them. But they seem desperate to know it. And they also tend, as Con would say, they had a hard time judging Americans' age all the time. And so, he didn't ask me the first day, but the second day, at the end of the second day, Con, and there's Con and me at Haiphong Harbor, or in Haiphong Bay there, Halong Bay. Con came up to me and said, "Mr. Toad, how old are you?" And I said, "Con, I knew you were going to ask that. I know that you need to know how old I am. And I was waiting for you to ask. I've been told," I told him, I said, "I have been told that I look young for my age. So you might be surprised to know that this is in 2018, I'm 53 years old." And he got so embarrassed. He put his hand over his eyes. He bowed his head. He walked away from me. He walked back towards me. He bowed over and over and said, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And I said, "Con, what? What's the problem?" I said, "You thought I was younger, huh?" He said, "Yes." And I said, and the reason it's so important is, first of all, age is, your age determines how much respect you're given, how much preference you're given. The older you are, the more respect you're due. And that means in everything. You're the first in, you're the first out, you're the first served. Your preferences override everybody else's. If you decide we're going to make a right-hand turn here, the bus makes a right-hand turn there. I mean, that's it. It's an absolute rule that age puts you at the top of the hierarchy. And the other reason people have to know your age is because the Vietnamese language does not have pronouns. If you want to think about that for a bit, there's no word for he or she or they. Imagine not being able to use those words. And that means that everybody then, if you don't know somebody's name, you refer to people by a family noun. And the Vietnamese have many, many, many more family nouns than we do. So what family nouns do we have? We have mom and dad and brother and sister and aunt and uncle and cousin and grandfather and great-grandfather. We have a lot, but they have way more than that. They have a word, for example, that is just for your father's younger sister who's unmarried. So it's a special variant of the word aunt. That's very specific. And they have many words like that. And those are the words they use. They attach it to you depending on your age. So I said, "Con, what had you been calling me?" And he said, "Well, because I thought you were young, I was calling you big brother." And I said, "What do you call me knowing that I'm an old guy at 53? He said, "I call you young uncle." And that was good. He said, "That is good. Like your status in my eyes went up because you're older." So that age is so important. The Vietnamese language, I did, like a good traveler, I had wanted to learn a little bit of the language and use a little bit of language. But the more I read, I'm not great with languages. I'm not good with languages at all, anyhow. And the more I read about the Vietnamese language, the more intimidating it seemed. And I just avoided it because it seems so indecipherable to me. It's a monosyllabic language. Every word, one syllable. So the city Saigon is actually two words. Saigon. The city Hanoi is two words. Ha-noi. Everything, every word, one syllable. Imagine that. That really limits the words that you could have if every word has to be one syllable. And so the distinction among the words' meanings is made through tones, through spoken tones. And there are 6 different tones. So you could have one word, ha. Depending on the tone you use to say it, it could mean 6 different things. So for example, here you have the word ma. It could mean, depending on the tone you use, ghost, butt, cheek or mother, tomb, grave, horse, code, or rice seedling. All depending on the tone you use. In other words, you could have all the right words, but choose the wrong tone, and you're saying something completely different. It has Vietnam is a language of vowels. It has tones, 12 different vowels, six different tones. That's 72 distinct vowel sounds, and that does not include the diphthongs, where we combine vowel sounds like we do in English, e, a, I. You could do that in Vietnamese also. They're called diphthongs, triphthongs. You combine 3 vowels to those. It means we're talking. There are tones and sounds in the hundreds. Somebody said it's like singing a language with sounds you never knew existed. And that's why when you hear people speaking Vietnamese, it's always up and down. It sounds up and down, up and down, up and down. That there's so much tone involved in speaking, and it's really easy for an English speaker to screw it up. And I always love to tell. I wrote about this story in the magazine, but I always love to tell the story of Robert McNamara visiting Saigon in 1964, and of course, this is when JFK's Ich bin ein Berliner speech in Berlin in 1963 was still on everybody's minds. McNamara wanted to give kind of a pep talk in Saigon. And in 1964, he gave a speech there, and he wanted to end the speech with the phrase, "Long live South Vietnam." And he nailed it, except he got the tones wrong. And what he actually said was, "The Southern duck wants to lie down." And everybody in the room erupted in laughter because they knew he had screwed it up. I did not want to face that embarrassment, so I just kept to English the whole time. And that's what I think do on this trip also. I thought I would do another part 2 to this talk that would be next Wednesday night, 7 p.m. I'll send out an email about it. And if you don't get our emails, let me know, and I'll make sure you do get our emails. You can put your email or your contact information here in the chat. You could contact me through our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org, and I will send you a reminder about the talk. The talk is going to be about the war. It's going to be about encountering the war, what you see, how you encounter the war on the trip, on the travel in Vietnam. And it's going to be about like how the war began, why the U.S. got involved, how it got involved, and how it was fought. So it'll be heavy on the war history. All right, let's open it up. Let's talk a little bit. We have over a half an hour to talk. I see. Oh gosh, we got Bamboo Bob in the room. That's wonderful. Hello, Bamboo Bob. Anybody who wants to say anything or ask a question, make a comment, maybe a rebuttal, feel free to raise your hand electronically or wait. Oh, here we go. George Kniss. And then we have Bruce, and we have Rosemary, Don Nemchek. Don, I'm going to let you go first because you're clearly the oldest person in the room. Nancy Sawyer, how are you? You have the honor of age, Don.
Well, thank you. I think, Todd, but perhaps I should go back to Vietnam with you. And
That's right.
A lot more respect than I'm getting.
You'd be like a god, yeah.
That's funny. Well, Todd, my question is, why did the Chinese want Vietnam? Was it for natural resources? Was it for their imperialism? What caused them to force themselves to go into Vietnam at a great cost of life?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
That's a great question, and I don't really have a good answer for it. I mean, certainly there are a lot of natural resources in the north, or coal mines especially, but I'm not sure that the Vietnamese were after that in the north. I imagine that trading routes, strategic trading routes through the South China Sea and through the East Sea were what they were after. They were after control of the Delta. They were after, any Delta region is going to be rich agricultural soil, which it is, rich alluvial soil coming down from the mountains, great for rice cultivation. I think it meant wealth to the Han Dynasty to control an established, well-off society just to their south. I think that was the motive. Nancy Smoyer, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. I went back to Vietnam in '92 with the Vietnam Veterans Restoration Project, and I was a donut dolly in Vietnam, and I didn't really want. I didn't want to go at all, but I had been carrying anger toward the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese government, and I knew that wasn't my normal way of responding to people. And so I thought maybe if I went back, it would help. And it turned things around completely for me. And so now I say to veterans that, especially the less you want to go back, the more you should go back.
Oh.
But it's awfully hard to convince people of that.
Boy, is that interesting. Nancy,
Yep.
So you really did harbor negative feelings toward the Viet. And when you went back in 1992, it was a different world, a different Vietnam than it is today. I mean, I think it's so much easier to go back now because everything is more familiar. The strategic relationship, I mean, even as we speak, is getting closer. When you went in 1992, it was still one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Boy, how interesting. George Kniss, and then I want to go to Tom and Ben. George Kniss.
Yes, been a while. I've been detached because my wife was seriously ill. I had to take care of her.
Yeah.
And she passed away a couple months ago.
Oh, George, I'm sorry. I didn't know that.
Just wanted you to know why I've been so absent and distant.
Yeah. Oh, George,
It was
I'm very sorry about that, to hear about your wife.
Yeah. Anyway, I wanted to supplement the things you said about, because I was there in 63, 64, and I saw Vietnam that was still French.
Yeah.
And you have to remember that there was not only the Chinese influence on the peninsula of Vietnam and everything, it was the French colonization of over 250 years. And you got to remember that in the northern part, they gained independence in 1955. They kicked the butt of the French army in the military at Dien Bien Phu, and the French did a ceasefire. They divided Vietnam, and the South continued with their French culture.
Yeah.
And then the American culture moved in. But the North was fully independent then from 1955 on.
Yeah.
So, and the one thing I wanted to inject here about the language, which is so interesting. I'm glad you've done so much in depth on this. The tonal language and the spelling, this is all French. You know that, I'm sure. The French invented this for the Vietnamese and subjugated them to it. And that, I don't know how the Vietnamese feel about it today, but it was a revolutionary thing at the time. And, but I mean, the French were there 250 years, culture, language, administration, military, they imbued themselves into the Vietnamese culture. But the tonal thing is definitely a French invention that needs to be spoken about.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Yeah. And lastly, I just want to remark about the crossing of the streets. And the Confucius part of the religious. Well, there are many religions and sub-religions within the Vietnamese culture too. I mean, certainly Confucianism is the dominant one, but Buddhism and subcultures of religion, which the Vietnamese fight among themselves all the time, probably less today because of the unity.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's. I want to go back, and for the what is it? How many times have you gone now? This is the third time, Todd.
Time.
Yeah, and I've had to cancel every time.
Yeah.
It was because of my sister. Then
Yep.
it's because of my wife. It was because of my own health for a period. I'm not giving up,
Right.
and I want to talk to you guys when you get back again.
Okay.
I'm gonna go back if they have to ship me in a coffin.
You know, George mentioned the language. Yes, this is the original Vietnamese language, which is in the kind of ideographs from
Chinese.
China. Yes. And then the French introduced this Latin alphabet with these
Right.
they're called diacritical marks that indicate tone. And so people today in Vietnam, they can't read this, but they do read this generally.
Yeah.
That's my understanding. Tom R.
Question for you. I served in Kon Tum province and worked closely with the Monyards.
Mhm.
And I've read different stories over the years that they have been the object of genocide. The land has been taken from them. They've been driven out of the area or just totally annihilated. Can you add anything to that? Is there any substance to that?
Yeah, the population of Vietnam is incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
The Vietnamese are the main ethnic group, but there are dozens of other ethnic groups, and I mean they don't speak Vietnamese; they speak other languages. They have other religions. They have other forms of dress. They're very different. And each one of them has their own relationship with the government and with the Vietnamese majority population. As you know, some of them, like the Hmong people, became recruited by the Americans during the war and fought on the U.S. side during the war. And they certainly have suffered enormously at the hands of the communists since the war and during and since. And there are other groups of Montagnards. Montagnard is a French name for mountain people. So they tend to be people who live, outside the major cities and in villages. And so, yeah, so it varies from group to group is my understanding. Cao, I'm going to ask you to unmute. You have a Vietnamese name, so you know what you're talking about, I would think. How are you? Thank you for joining us.
Well, good evening. Yes, I am a Vietnamese American. My name is Hai Cao. And if you talk about culture and tradition, I specifically spell my name in the Vietnamese way.
Okay.
Cao is a last name, Thai is a middle name, and Hai is the first name. But in my day-to-day at work, I had to reverse them. Hai Cao.
Okay. Hi, Cal. So you go by Hi.
Right.
Okay. Great.
First of all, I would like to say that I really appreciate and I commend you and all of the veterans because I grew up during the Vietnam War and I left Vietnam on the April 30, 1975 before Todd was even born.
Wow.
So my deep appreciation, I'm grateful for the sacrifice of all of the veterans. And I have been here since 75 and I never been back to Vietnam.
Whoa.
So I didn't know a lot of things that Todd just sharing from the beginning, and I intended to follow this program and listen to learn about my own culture, or I know my culture because I'm very interested in history and the world and all that. And my parents also teach me all along. But what I didn't know is what's going on right now, because I've never been there. And I'm very, very active in politics and anti the communist Vietnam over there right now. I belong to the group of Global Democracy, and I've been fighting the corruption in the communist Vietnam over there. And I got people over there. I've never been there, but I got people there work with me to provide me on the evidence of corruption and suppression and persecution of the people in Vietnam. So yeah, I enjoyed the Zoom meeting tonight. Thank you.
Hi, two questions for you. Number one, do you get our Veterans Breakfast Club emails and information?
Yes, Todd, regularly.
Okay, good.
I attended, not every time, but I had attended before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I would love to have you come on sometime, and maybe others who, like you, immigrated here from Vietnam at the end of the war, or during the war, or later. Talk about your experiences of the war, your memories of the war, and your experiences growing up here in the U.S. I think that would be a really wonderful thing for us to do.
I'll be glad to do that. In fact, speaking of the alphabet, Vietnamese alphabet, and people talk about that's what the French. That exactly very correct, Todd. There was a Catholic priest. His name is Alexander de Rhodes.
Yep.
And he died, and he was buried in Japan, believe it or not. So there were a lot of people in the U.S., especially Vietnamese American Catholics, and they made a visit to his tomb in Japan. There you go. Yeah. Alexander de Rhodes.
Yes. Alexander de Rhodes, very important influence in Vietnam, a French Jesuit priest. And a lot of Jesuits died in Vietnam. A lot of Jesuits worked with the Vietnamese. They're the ones that introduced the language. Yes.
Right.
In the
Right.
100. Very important. Thank you so much. Hi.
Thank you.
Ben Wright.
Well, Todd, I just have a couple of encouragements. One is I would encourage people to watch your whole series on Vietnam. I had the privilege of being in your class at Penn State Beaver in 2015 and saw the whole bit. Now I see what you've integrated from our trips. And since I went on the 2018 trip, I think anybody that hasn't gone should jump at the opportunity and go. It's great. And our group, we bonded together. We still get together, for dinner and those kinds of things occasionally. And the fact that the documentary happened, and those of you who are going or are interested in going, I would suggest, I think it's only a couple dollars to stream from Amazon to watch that 1 hour documentary. But you see the changes, people like Steve Foreman went back to where he, buried 200 Viet Cong who perished in a battle that he was involved in, and Lou Nudie, who was with MACV and served in Mito in the Mekong Delta and ran back and forth to Saigon, and how much it meant to him to go back to there. In fact, I was visiting with his brother today. Many of you know that Lou died last Saturday. And so I went to visitation today, and I visited with Lou's brother and some of the things about how important it was to Lou to go back. And I would encourage anybody to go. Even people say, no, I shouldn't go. You should.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ben. Absolutely. I agree. It's a wonderful experience. So much of the wonder of the trip is just traveling together with people who care. They really care about each other. They care about the country. They care about the veterans on the trip and their own service. And it's a wonderful, wonderful experience. I want to go to Bruce Unks and then Justin in Dallas. Hey, Bruce, how are you?
Good. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
All right, I can hear you.
Okay. A couple of things. Number one, let's back on this beer thing. What's the alcohol content on that on that beer?
Yeah. That beer is like your Budweiser. It's like 4.5, 5%,
Okay.
like that. However, Chad Riddle will tell you, and he's away from his camera right now. Chad, oh, there you are, Chad. Becky Nyron and I and a couple other people. I think my daughter Ellie also. We went to a wonderful craft brewery in Saigon. I mean, it was fantastic. Called The Heart of Darkness, Chad.
Yes, it is. The Heart of Darkness.
And I ordered, you know how you could order like a flight of beers, those little guys of different flavors.
You don't want to do that.
I did not appreciate how strong they were going to be. And man, I was like Spider-Man walking out of that. Great.
Another thing, I read a little bit about Vietnam, and my understanding is the French really loved the food that was made in Vietnam, and that was one of the main reasons they like to own it and take it over, and and that's and that. And another thing, are you going to talk about Ho Chi Minh?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Because I know he was a big influence, obviously, in the war and why they got into the war and all that. So, okay, good.
I'm going to talk about the war, the American war, how it was fought. I'm going to talk about the French invasion and colonization. I'll certainly talk about Ho Chi Minh and the resistance movement. Talk about the peasants, North and South, what their motives were. Yeah, I'm gonna really get into it in the next few weeks. Okay. Justin in Dallas, and I also want to Rob. We have Rob Bamboo Bob who lives in Da Nang, real expert. Not from Vietnam originally, but real expert in Vietnam. I think we also have Alec on, and I would love to have them say a piece or two. Justin, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you doing tonight?
Very good.
I go back to a little bit of what you were talking about. I had a considerable amount of experience up near Tay at a place called Cao Dai Temple, an area that really was never bombed. It was never touched. It had as many religions in there as possible. And I met a young man, a Buddhist monk, and we got to be acquaintances. In 2001, I went back, the first time I'd been back, and I did it 3 weeks. Took my guide out of Saigon, and we went up there, and I had a picture of the two of us on the steps of the Cao Dai Temple, and I wanted to give it to him if he was still there. He died 6 months before I got there.
Oh.
And the gentleman who was the head now, he was the head of the church there for a while, asked me to stay. And there were 2,900 people that over a course of an hour came to the church to see that picture.
How about that?
Almost every religion you could think of in the world. My guide, who was a former South Vietnamese Marine, who went through all the regrouping, whatever they do it, he said, I can't believe you were here, because nobody comes up here and sees anything like this. He said, well, it's just one of those things. I love Vietnam. I've been back 3 times. I've had the guide in Hanoi who was right out of communist scooter school tell me how bad we were and try to take me to an American restaurant, and I take him in his neighborhood, and I said, you showed me a noodle house in your neighborhood, you take me there. I do not want to eat American, I want to eat Vietnamese.
Right.
And before we left to go back to the car, I sat him down in the corner and made him have green tea on the corner on a little stool. And when we left, last of the story is we went to have some beer. There was a little girl who came into the bar. She was the Smirnoff shooter girl. And he was enamored, although he's married with 2 kids. I got a couple of pictures of him. We went to the airport in Hanoi. he was trying to give me a bottle of Smirnoff, and I said, I can't take it on the plane. But I said, Tuan, you understand something. I have your address and your wife's email address, and I'm going to keep track of you. I also have the pictures from last night of you and the scooter girl. We've kept in touch now. That was in 2021. We've kept in touch, and he does tours for this lady out of Seattle, but he went to the websites I gave him to learn more about what was going on during the Vietnam War.
Yes.
From the other side, that the atrocity went both sides. And I always remember him talking about Hanoi. And I said, you understand, if we wanted to bomb you back in the dark ages, we could have done it. We didn't do it.
Right.
Long and short is, I agree. Everybody who hasn't been ought to go back. Whether you just go to Saigon and hit 5 of the hotels and see a Filipino band play over at the Majestic, looking over the river, it doesn't matter. The people are fabulous.
Yeah, they are.
It's fabulous. And other than that, I don't know what to say.
Well, you mentioned the Cao Dai, and that might be a mystery to many people. Vietnam is kind of hard to explain. There are indigenous religions that were invented in the 20th century with a lot of followers, and one of them is Cao Dai. We did visit a Cao Dai temple in 2020 in the Mekong Delta. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I mean, it's certainly like a church.
Is that the one up near Tay Ninh?
This is the one in Tay Ninh. This is the famous big one.
That's where I was.
Yeah, this is where you were. This is the famous one. It is a religion that incorporates a lot of other religions that had 2 million followers. It was pretty much an autonomous community.
That's true. They had Catholic nuns on the premise.
Yes.
They had Buddhists, and everybody seemed to be there.
Yes,
But
it's quite eccentric and not quite like anything that I've ever encountered anywhere else. And there are a couple other sects like that.
right.
Just
The-
remark.
One of the big things was one of the trips that got me to meet this young man when we took our 3 chaplains. We had a Catholic, Jewish, and an Episcopal chaplain for the division. We went up there for a meeting, and this young man and a couple others were talking about just religion in general and beliefs. And
Yeah.
it was very interesting to hear the thing. Of course, it was always interesting with our chaplains because the Jewish chaplain was rated as the best one at giving a Catholic service. The Catholic chaplain was the best one at giving a Jewish service. And the Episcopal chaplain was the best one to go drinking with.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Justin. Thank you very much. Hey, Nancy, I thought that I saw you raising your hand. Maybe you want to make a comment or ask a question.
Oh, I did. And I wanted to talk about religion, and I'm really excited to hear the conversation tonight. Most of the people that I meet in America who have come from Vietnam are Catholic. And I'm particularly excited when I go back. This, Todd, I'm traveling with you, and I'm going to Da Nang for 6 days before I join the Veterans Breakfast Club tour. And a lot of it is so that I can visit churches in the Da Nang area. And I want to see the schools and hospitals that Friends of Da Nang have helped to rebuild. And I want to go to some house churches and to some other churches and hang with college students at 2 colleges in Da Nang. And I fortunately have a missionary young couple who are there associated with the Coalition for Christian Outreach here in Pittsburgh. And I just can't wait to learn more. But I think the thing I want to know more from you in the future, Todd, is how religion played a role and how religious people played a role in the war. And I also want to visit that convent near Da Nang where the nuns saved the life of my good friend, Dr. Bruce Bickle.
Oh, wow.
When he was shot down, and he was hidden by some nuns, and I want to go see them and just pray with them in his honor. And I think religion is an important part of Vietnam.
Enormous part of Vietnam, enormous and enormously complex. Yes,
Yeah.
Monks, of course, played a really important role in the uprising in 1963. The Catholic Church played a very important role in the South, especially around Saigon. You know, Rob, you're in Da Nang. You've lived in Da Nang for quite some time. Do you know the church that Nancy refers to?
I don't, Todd. I'm sorry. I just made a note. I'm going to go and check it out. And Nancy, maybe
Yeah.
come and track us down. We'll take a look together.
Well, I would love that. And I know the name of the convent, so I'll send it to you as well,
Great.
because it's just an amazing story. He's an American war hero, Navy pilot, shot down, worked with an orphanage in his first venture there. And so he signed up for a second tour just so he could continue with the orphanage, and almost immediately was shot down. And he's just one of my very favorite people who's suffering right now from Parkinson's caused by Agent Orange.
Well,
Wow.
I'm sorry here. I'm in Toronto, Canada right now, but I'll be back in Vietnam in a couple of weeks again.
Okay.
And, yeah, you can track us down at Bamboo Bob in Da Nang. We got a place there. We just hang out together. Get a bunch of people on motorcycles. We go riding around to waterfalls and sites. And Todd, to your earlier point, I lived for a number of years in Hanoi when I first started spending time around 2017 in Vietnam. And so I just wanted to go back to the money thing and the roles between the women and men. And I found this super interesting, by the way. Just really great to sit with you folks today and hear all this. But so one thing you'll notice if you're in restaurants in Vietnam is if there's a family there and you're ready to pay, the women always take the money. The men never, ever touch the money. And I was really wondering a lot about this. And what I've learned is that men who are working, when they come home with their money, they give it to their wife. And the man then gets an allowance. So the women manage, patriarchal or not, the women are exclusively the managers of the money in Vietnam. So I don't know what you want to call that, but the men who want to go drinking and have bia hoi and we're hanging around with me on the streets of Hanoi, they don't have a lot of money to spend because they're on a pretty short leash when it comes to their paycheck.
Oh, how funny. And I should, we're going to Bamboo Bob's. We're gonna see you in Vietnam.
You are.
We're going to be having dinner. We're doing one night in Da Nang, and we're going to have dinner at your place. And I'm very much looking forward to it.
Me too.
Mary Nell Gage. Hey, Sister Mary Nell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm wondering if the orphanage about which Nancy is speaking, and Rob, is Sacred Heart that's out at China Beach. And there are sisters there on China Beach where the orphanage was, Sacred Heart. And there are some of the same order sisters who also have a home. Well, the street was years ago Yenbay, Yenbay, but I'm not sure if the name got changed for cultural and political reasons.
Yenbay, that was the Yenbay Rebellion in the 1930s, or mutiny, I think. Mary Nell was a nun in Vietnam. I saw you nodding your head, yes, Nancy, that is Sacred Heart.
I believe it is, but I'll send that information to you, Todd. I will look at my notes from Bruce and be happy to share that.
And I will connect you to Mary Nell, who's in Colorado now.
Oh, thank you so much.
This is so
and the children who were adopted from Sacred Heart, they would love to know that story. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's just amazing that we all have so many stories, and it's good that we can share them together. Yeah.
I'm amazed, and Mary Nell could speak, of course, much more than I could, but how orphanages work in Vietnam. There are a lot of them. There have been a lot of orphans over the decades, and orphanages function as a family, as a surrogate family. And so, you know, here in the US, if you're an orphan, and both my grandparents were orphans, they went to orphanages and they never talked about it. And of course, it was a nightmare experience. In Vietnam, the orphanage becomes your family. And so when you grow up and out and live, you go back to the orphanage often for holidays. And family is just so important to the Vietnamese, and their definition of family, I think, is very different from the definitions that we use.
Thank you.
What a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad that we're doing this. Again, I'll be on again. It's going to be a little bit more intense, I think, next Wednesday, talking about the war itself and how the U.S. got involved and how it was fought in the southern part of the South, and how it was fought near I Corps differently. And I think we'll get a lot of perspectives and experiences from many of you who served. Is there anybody else with a question or a comment they would like to make? An insight? Oh, Justin. Yeah, I agree with you, Rob. Justin is not a guy to go to Vietnam with. He seems like he'd take pictures and blackmail you.
I have one question. On your trip, how are you traversing the country?
We are traversing the country in two different ways. One, using a motor coach, and Deb Bussinger had the temerity to ask, will it be air conditioned? I mean, come on. What could you imagine traveling in Vietnam? Well, you guys could imagine because you did. Because you did it, right? But it's hard. Yeah, it's going to be it's a nice motor coach, and then we also take 2 flights in country. We take 2 domestic flights from Hanoi to Phu Bai, and then one from Da Nang to Tan Son Nhut.
Okay. When you get to Tan Son Nhut, be sure and look at the terminal really well, because if the revetments are still there that were there in 2005.
Yep, they were still there.
There's some old planes still up in the old part of the airport. Are you going to the tunnels of Cu Chi?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, well, look for if there's a captain, Vietnamese captain there, he's really tall. Look for him. He'll take the big fat guys like me easily to the White Tunnel.
Yeah, the Cu Chi tunnels, totally fascinating. I will be talking about them next week. Yes.
They came right up under us in 69, and we found out that there were tunnels under Cu Chi.
Yes. The U.S. knew early that there were tunnels under Cu Chi, but what we didn't know was how extensive they were. Far more extensive than I think we ever could have imagined. Ben Wright, you flew in and out of Tan Son Nhut. You were the one who, I believe in 2018, pointed to the revetments and said,
yes, they're still there.
They're still there.
I was surprised to see them, even though they built a modern terminal, that they're still using the things that were there when they took over a really well-developed aerodrome.
Yeah, and you see it in Da Nang too at the airport. The original American military buildings that are still there, and
yeah,
still
Quonset huts are everywhere.
Quonset huts, yeah, just amazing to me. Really, it's so neat to see those kind of remnants or echoes from history. Hey, thank you all for joining us. What a fascinating conversation that we had. I hope you'll join us again on Wednesday night at 7 p.m. We're also doing, that is next Wednesday night at 7 p.m. That'll be the 13th. We're also doing a program open conversation on Monday night at 7 p.m. It'll be Patriot Day, September 11th. I hope you'll join us then. If you want to get in contact with me and you don't have my information, go to veteransbreakfastclub.org. You could email me from there. Hey, good night, everybody. Take care. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.